I felt successful if I was doing something right, but it felt like only work counted.
My mum got pregnant miraculously with a child, and then due to a hospital error, my sister died at birth. So from the age of about sort of like 7 to sort of like 10, 12, every Sunday prayer time was, praying for a sibling.
Choosing, am I going to be God-focused in this or am I going to be self-focused in this is always a choice.
I challenged God a lot about track record, and it was really clear to me that every time I thought I would either have a breakdown or completely lose it or concocted in my head this was going to be the end, I wouldn't make it past a certain period. Every single time it was like God just dropped a life raft.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Magnify Conversations. If you're new to Magnify, firstly, welcome. It's great to have you. Magnify is a platform focused on empowering ambitious women of faith to thrive in every area of our lives. I don't know about you, but I sometimes find faith can be really challenging and difficult to speak about in today's world, and that's why we've created this podcast.
The Magnify Conversations are all about bringing everyday, authentic women together to discuss faith, relationships, career, whatever's kind of important that we're speaking about at the moment.
My name is Ruth, and I'm the founder and CEO of Magnify.
And I'm Rachel, and I'll be the host of the Magnify Conversations.
So if you like this episode, don't forget to share with a friend, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel.
Thank you for joining us for the Magnify Conversations today as we dig into the question, is it okay to challenge our faith? With our guests, Jessica Reece Okotan and Sheyi Martins-Allen. Jessica is Halfpenny London's managing director. She has a passion for business, female-focused fashion, and delivering expert quality that makes women feel comfortable and elevated. Sheyi is a singer-songwriter who is also a wife and mother to her 4-year-old daughter. Her and her husband run a tutoring business together to instill confidence in others. Let's get into it. Okay, quick fire questions. This is one that was added in by Team Magnify at the last minute because we feel it elicits a strong response. So, cream egg or Bounty?
Cream egg.
Bounty.
Oh. Am I allowed to hear why?
I don't like coconut.
Oh, okay.
That's
Pretty
it.
straightforward.
I love coconut and cream egg's too sweet for me. I think.
Okay.
It's too rich.
Women that know what you like. If you could hire anyone to do one chore for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Laundry. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do any washing, hanging up, drying, none of it.
I feel you.
I think just cleaning the house, which is the whole thing.
That's me one chore.
Yeah,
clean the house. Yeah, you're a smart girl. How do you switch off and relax? What's the number one way? If you're like, I've got to switch off tonight, this is what I'm going to do.
I do like to get invested in a show of some sort, whether it be Amazon Prime, Netflix, Disney Plus. I like to get invested in some sort of series, and that does, or trash TV like Love Island. Like absolute trash.
Switch off TV.
Yeah.
For me, if it's daytime, I love to go for a walk. But if it's night, I do love watching binge shows as well. But I think reading ultimately fully relaxes me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, I've got another question before we move on. What would be your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, there are a few
Dare you
options.
say what it is?
Well, I'm a singer, so people hate me doing karaoke. So they're like, no, you're not supposed to do karaoke.
So tell us, come on then. Tell us how you're going to absolutely showcase your talent on this karaoke.
I'm trying to think, what was the last thing? I think Rolling in the Deep by Adele is a good one to do, a karaoke. But then people are like, oh, for goodness sake, don't do that. That's not the point, because now we can't do what we're supposed to do afterwards. So
If I did do it, I think it'd be like an 80s, song of some sort. Yeah, I don't know what though.
80s power ballads or 80s pop tune.
Yeah,
I can see that.
Power ballad.
I can see it working. Power ballad. Yeah. It's kind of, maybe the question isn't maybe it's like if you could sing any song, it would be, and you could sing it well.
Then I'd love to sing Adele.
Yeah, exactly. Right, Rolling in the Deep. You can sing it well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so obviously our conversation today is going to be all around just talking about faith when we're in a dark place. And hearing both of your stories today will be incredible because obviously we have lots of different experiences in life, ebbs and flows. And certainly for us as the Magnify community, we want to live an authentic faith. And I think sometimes when we're going through something that's difficult, it can be easy to lean into a bit of a pseudo faith and false positivity and kind of pretend things are okay when they're not. And knowing that God gives us joy in the middle of things, and that's not necessarily in a peaceful situation, but also just being able to have the real conversation. And I guess ask ourselves, like, is it really okay to challenge faith? And so I guess through hearing your stories, it would be amazing to delve deeper into that and have those conversations. So starting with you, Jessica, I would first of all just love to know, how did you come to the point where you decided to follow God? Like, tell us a bit of your story.
I mean, I grew up in church, so, I think it was a bit assumed that I would. And so I think it feels vague when I reflect on when that moment was. Like, it didn't feel like it was a singular moment. But I think when I was about 19, I think I really had, I sort of challenged God in a way. I was needing something. I was needing a full-time job. I didn't have a full-time job after my study. And just all the doors were closing. And so I was looking for myself. Like, I was trying, I think I was striving, I guess, to try and find that solution. And I just sort of felt I needed to tithe consistently. That was the challenge, that it felt like my mood is so attached to my financial status, truly, even now still, and so for me, it felt really sacrificial to actually consistently tithe. And I think it was within a few days, like it was a really short period of time. And I was offered like a full-time job, which has led to the career I have, but it was such an obvious answer to prayer. And so I think that was the moment where I felt like I could actually trust God with my life, if that makes sense. That was the moment I really the first time I gave over, I think, probably.
Yeah, because that was a big thing for you.
Yeah.
So to invite him into the middle of that.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I think that's the moment.
Sheyi, how about you? What about your story of coming to that point of choosing to follow God?
So similarly, I grew up in church. My parents were Christians. It was, I have a Nigerian Christian father, and he was like, obviously you have to go to church every Sunday. That wasn't a discussion. It was just something that you had to do. And so it definitely grew up having a faith and understanding. I think my parents very much did let me decide if it was my thing, but obviously there were certain things I had to do. So I knew about God, and there was a relationship with God. I think during my 20s, I kind of like did my own thing. It was sort of a nice accessory, as it were. But I have, solid friends at church. There was always a community. I loved community. But I would say, actually, ironically, in terms of like a personal relationship with God, it's come about as a result of very, very difficult times in my life. And that's when things have switched. So a very recent one, I think I've kind of understood God in a completely different way very recently. And I think in sort of mid-20s as well, just before I met my husband as well, I think that was another kind of like pivotal moment. So I'd say, mid-20s, mid-30s, maybe every middle of a decade.
Have been
every
key
middle of a
moments.
decade, I get to know I just find God again every time.
Can you talk a bit some of those challenges?
Yeah, so I do not deal with unknowns very well at all. So unknowns are a big trigger for me. So when I was in my early 20s, I was single and wasn't very comfortable with being single. And I'm very I take responsibility for lots of things, and I'm not very good at surrendering. So I would like to get stuff done myself. So for me, I was like, I'm single. What can I, do about it? Do I go on the dating app? What do I do? And it wasn't something I could control, which sends my mind slightly doolally because I can't control it. And I was really struggling, to be honest, with being single. And just before I met my husband, I did actually surrender it. I did. I don't know why, but I did actually surrender it. And went, okay, you know what, God, I can't control this. And before, I kind of used to look at statistics and go, well, in church, women outnumber men 2-1, and I'm black and I'm female. So if we look at the statistics on my odds of how that would happen, then it's going to be really, really, I turn myself into like a crazy spin with it. But I did surrender it, and then ironically met my husband, and he was great. And you kind of look back on it and you go, all the people that I kind of asked God about, what was I thinking? Like, God was very, very smart to completely ignore every single thing that I was asking for. So that was pretty pivotal. And then recently going through secondary infertility, something also that my parents went through, big trigger point. So I think that's one step further, but it was also an unknown. Like, no one can guarantee you a baby at the end. But again, my relationship with God it's been going on for about 2.5 years, but my relationship definitely in the past sort of like 6 months with God it's transformed for both my husband and for me. And the best way I would describe it is, someone said to me, if God doesn't deliver you from the pain, then God will preserve you in it. And it's felt very much like we've been preserved in it. So there are times where I would expect to react in a certain way, and I have not. And it's totally bizarre. It's totally counter to the way I would normally behave. And doesn't make sense. The only way that makes sense is if God is in there. So, and that's transformed like my relationship with God and how I see God, and for both my husband and I. So yeah, it's been spectacular actually.
Yeah, even just very recently for you then as well. So,
yeah.
Wow. How about you then in that, Jessica? What have been kind of some of the key aspects that have challenged your faith since being on that journey?
I think for me, it's sort of, I'm like you, I'm really bad with the unknown. And I think my purpose and where that sits, I think it's my purpose that's been the thing I've sort of felt challenged with the most along the way. And I guess that was always to do with career for me more than anything else. I very much wanted to be married. I didn't get married till I was 33. But it wasn't, for me, I was a bit the same in the way that I couldn't control it. So actually I chose career. And I think that was not always the best decision. I think God had more than just that for me. But I think, I've been very attached to purpose. And so challenged in the times when I didn't have that job, like I've just shared, or when I was in a place where I didn't feel like I was in my purpose, and even if God had me there. So I think that's when I felt the most challenged.
Yeah. Have you had anything recently that has been challenging, like maybe in your work or personally, that you kind of like...
I really have, but I haven't even processed it fully, if I'm honest. So I don't know how to share it yet, actually. But I started having therapy last November, and so I feel I'm going backwards in so many ways because I'm unpacking and breaking down and trying to understand. And there's a lot going on personally and professionally, and I still haven't sort of worked through it, but my faith is being tested, I guess, in that right now, in trying to, I guess, relearn things about myself and how to move forward.
So just going back to some of those earlier times, maybe just after you come to faith and you're on this journey and figuring out who you are. I know you said it wasn't just like a big moment, but as you maybe felt you were following God a little more, can you talk a little bit to whether you had the language and the ability to talk about like how you were feeling? So, you're saying even about feeling quite attached to finance and that being attached to like whether you're doing well and things. Did you feel you had the ability to express that at the time, or did it feel a bit of a taboo?
I think it's hindsight more than anything. I think all the challenges I've gone through, I feel like I look back and I'm then grateful, or I then sort of see, which is why it's hindsight, isn't it? So I just, I don't think there has been a lot of time when I've been in it and realised. There was one time, so I'd lived here for 2 years. I was taken back to Australia for 2 years. And in that time, I felt depressed because I felt like I wasn't where I was supposed to be, but I also knew God had me there. So that's probably the one time I can remember feeling such a raw emotion and talking to God about it, actually. I think previously it's always been in hindsight, but in that moment, I sort of knew I was up against something I didn't like, didn't know where I was going, but also just knew that actually I was where I was supposed to be anyway.
And that, I think sometimes, I know for me, like that fear of the unknown, we look for things that we can kind of know and things that we can control and that we know the outcomes too. And so I suppose I'd ask the same to you, Sheyi, and maybe some of your recent challenges, or your 25, your 35 type challenges that you spoke of. Do you feel like maybe in your 20s that you had at those times some of the language and the freedom to express where you were at?
No. I would say no. I think recently, also having worked with a therapist, because we, been going through IVF, and I knew at the beginning, as soon as I started IVF, I would need a therapist. It's very important to have an infertility specialist who can understand where your mind goes with this kind of stuff. And she was actually very good in helping me understand. She was like, actually, she asked me when we were on holiday in Thailand, she said, how do you deal with unknowns? And that sort of started an unraveling of, I was like, oh my God, not well. The track record is terrible, terrible. My mind goes berserk when it goes unknowns. It cannot cope. It tries to control everything. It just goes psycho. And she was actually, that started off a whole train of thought and thinking. I was like, oh my goodness, I've got to really work this out with God. And I think probably what I didn't do in my 20s that I started doing in my 30s is, in terms of the way of talking with God, I was much more honest. So now I will just talk to God about exactly how I'm feeling. I won't try and sugarcoat it. I won't try and say, oh, it's not that bad. I just say it how it is. In my 20s, I don't think I did that at all. And I didn't really work out that it was to do with the fact that as soon as I can't control it, as soon as you can't guarantee an outcome, because I think most of my, teenage years and early 20s had a pretty, textbook childhood. My parents were lovely. It was basically do your work. If you get these grades, you'll go to university, get a job. I mean, I followed all the steps, and the outcomes were all prescribed. I just hit that mark, get this thing. And then the first thing I could not control, what about if I want to get married? How do I make sure that that happens? Berserk, brain gone, just could not cope. Can't guarantee that you'll have children, but all that kind of stuff. I just don't deal with it better. But I've learned how to talk to God about that in a much healthier way than I did before. So now, in answer to your question, it was a very long-winded way of answering it. But I think I have the language now, yes, that I didn't have before.
And do you feel that's giving you a permission in your close relationships to do that more as well? Has that brought freedom, or do you still kind of that's fine between you and God, but perhaps wider, it's a challenge? Or
I think with my husband, it's great. We are really, really honest with each other, and that's good. So I think, we have that kind of communication, and it's allowed that. And I think when you're going through something that, we've been going through, you have to be honest with each other. You have to be, we've seen so many couples who are doing IVF or having infertility struggles. It's a real... It really can split couples because you can be in completely different places. And we've been so blessed that we're actually on the same wavelength and able to communicate really well, because it can basically rip apart your relationship. Often, not all the time, but can often be the woman who is very much, wants to continue, wants to drive it. And a lot of men absorbing a lot of stuff and going, I just can't deal with this anymore. Kind of ostrich head in sand, make it all go away immediately. I'm happy with just you and me, let's leave it. Can often be, not always, but can often be the way. And that can lead to, I've seen it a lot of times, it can lead to a lot of tension. But we didn't have that. By the grace of God, we didn't have that. We've always been on the same wavelength. So it helps,
Yeah. And just moving back to you, Jessica, just in your life so far, I guess I'm interested in how difficult times have maybe challenged your view of God. Because I think quite often we can think and believe certain things. And then when it comes to a difficulty, a fork in the road, something that looks different to what we've believed, we sometimes go, right, well, is what I've believed actually correct? Have you had any moments like that where you're like, I believed this isn't quite working out the way that I thought, and it's challenged a belief that you've had?
I just feel steadfast in knowing God has it, even if I'm not happy, or I feel out of my purpose personally, what I want, my desire maybe, not his purpose. So I feel like there's just something in me that's always just known. And so I have never struggled with my faith of questioning whether it's the right belief or not, because I think often I've known in my spirit what's happening to some degree, even when I knew I was, when I was living in Australia but wanted to be in London, didn't want to be there, but knew I was supposed to be there. And so I think there was still at least a peace there, even though I wasn't pleased. So I think, no, and I think sort of it's those different experiences that I've had in those moments, I feel like when I do look back on it, I can see exactly why God's had me there in hindsight. And so it's just cemented me for the next challenge to then, have that faith. And I don't know if it's because, I think when I feel out of control, sort of not out of control, when I feel overwhelmed and I can't control things, I think I avoid. So I think I probably avoid looking at what is the issue or where I should, is it my faith? Is it sort of how I'm dealing with it? I can be very bad in sort of dealing with it. So it tends to sort of wash with me. But I think it's, when I look back, I can see God's hand on everything, and it just gives me a forward view of trust, I guess.
Yeah, and just the sheer volume of like going through different things and having that solidified.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's been two big moments for me, and it's like the first moment rolled me on into the next, if that makes sense. And then that next moment, I'm still riding on the fact that I have absolute trust that, he's taking me to the right destination, wherever that is. I'm on the journey, and it's just the obedience of following that. Yeah.
Sheyi, what about you? With recently, where you've talked about infertility and you talked about the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years of your life, some of the challenges that you've had. Has there been anything that you've believed that has been challenged by the things that you've come up against?
Yeah, a lot. I think I really, really struggled with God's track record. So for, the ages of, so as I said, my I don't know if I said before, but my parents struggled with secondary infertility. So I watched this growing up, and then my mum got pregnant miraculously with a child, and then due to a hospital error, my sister died at birth. So from the age of about sort of like 7 to sort of like 10, 12, every Sunday prayer time was, praying for a sibling, and that didn't happen. So it affected very much how I viewed prayer and whether I saw it as effective or not at all. And I think for most of my 20s, I didn't really see it as effective. I thought it was maybe an extra cherry on the cake. I was like, you get stuff done yourself, and then maybe if God wants to kind of come and intervene at the end, then that's lovely. That's generally how I viewed it, because it didn't work at quite a pivotal moment in my childhood. And then obviously it felt like, or it has often felt like history's been repeating itself, as in we've had, almost an identical set of circumstances with me and my husband. Yeah, a lot of this has been a lot about track record, and that's how I've been talking to God, saying, this literally happened to my family. I watched it happen as I was growing up, and now we're running the same cycle. Is this basically all that you do? Do you just run the same cycle? And does prayer just not work? But it just hasn't been the same, and I can't deny that it hasn't been the same. And I have, God's really challenged me about that view, and in a weird sort of way, it kind of had to happen in the same way. So, for example, I don't actually really think I've ever really grieved my sister. I don't think that's actually ever happened. But because of what was happening with secondary infertility in my house, for the first time ever this year, I decided, I'm going to go to the grave with my parents. My mum does this every year, and my dad sometimes goes. And I was like, no, this year, January the 30th, when my sister was born, I'm going to go. And that was it was a pivotal point in my life. I had to do it. And without this circumstance kind of reincarnated or whatever, I wouldn't have done it. If I'm honest, I would never have gone. And sometimes I do feel like you have to get into a place with God where it's often felt like I'm in a boxing ring, and it is literally just me and God in the boxing ring. There's no one left. It's just me. Another IVF couple we talked to said something, it felt very poignant. They were like, it often felt like we were the last people in the casino, and everybody else had gone, and it was literally just us and God in the casino. And it feels very similar, but there are some pretty beautiful moments in that time where you have total reliance on God. And unlike other points in my life, this one I could not escape. There was no other element of control. IVF makes you think that you have a sense of control, but you don't actually. But it gets to a certain point where you don't. And so when it's just you and God, I actually feel like God can really talk to you in those moments. And that's where God's really, really challenged me in those moments. Been like, let's discuss some stuff. Let's talk about how you deal with unknowns. Let's talk about all these other bits here. Let's have a real conversation about that. Let's talk about relationship. Let's talk about how much you actually want to get to know me. Let's talk about how much do you know about me. Let's talk about the grief that you haven't dealt with. Let's talk about this. Now I've got your attention. Let's deal with all of this stuff. And I was like, okay, I'm going through I was clearly being taught. Like I was very much being taught, and God was taking me down a path. So it's been a pretty eye-opening experience.
And losing your sister at such a young age as well, and growing up with that being, I guess, the norm for you, that you saw your parents lose your baby sister and then be trying for another baby, and that not happening in the way that they'd hoped. Could you just tell us a bit more of like your childhood in the middle of that? Like, was that just normal to you? Did you know any different? What, reflecting on it as an adult, like how did that impact your formative years?
I think it did. It had a much bigger impact than I thought. Now looking back on it, had a huge impact mainly in terms of my relationship with God and what I actually thought, how effective I thought prayer was. And now that I'm 35, God really wants to deal with how I, view prayer. Apart from outside of that, I had a pretty idyllic childhood. My parents really tried to obviously compensate for the fact that I was an only child. They didn't want for me to be an only child. So my parents always prayed for me to have amazing friends, and I do. I have friends who are like siblings. My cousins are like my siblings. I didn't really lead a normal only child life. And, societally, people say stupid things to only children, honestly. They will assume that you're spoiled or you're selfish or you get a lot of random stuff. Or a lot of people would say to me when I was a kid, oh, you're not like a normal only child, as if that, I don't know what that means, but they were basically saying because I've been, highly socialized and I had cousins living in my house and things like that, it was very different. But yeah, I had a, really, really nice childhood, basically. But I knew there was this undercurrent. My earliest memory is my mum calling me from the hospital saying that I'm going to bring your sister home later on, and she never did. So that is like logged in my brain. And I do remember them going to the funeral as well. But so the fact that those are some of my earliest memories clearly shows that it was logged there in my brain. So it was kind of normal. It was, but I don't think at the time I ever really missed having a sibling because I just had other stuff, going on. But I'd say the biggest effect was how it just affected how I saw God. I didn't really realize it at the time, but that's just how it was for a long time.
And going through the secondary infertility that you're kind of working through now, has that caused you to come face to face with a lot of these? So going to see your sister's grave and things like that, would you say that's been triggered by just where you are now and feeling you've got to face some things?
I would never have gone if it wasn't for this happening in exactly the same way, as painful and as cruel as I felt it. I've said, but I've had that conversation with God. I've had that conversation. I've said, like, this is why, what's going on? Why is this happening? It's particularly cruel. And then added on top of that, my husband had a sister, grew up with a sister who was 29, but she died of cancer at 29. So I was starting to think, I was like, look, do we have like a problem with like siblings in this family? I went through the whole Job thing, to be honest, which is like, is there something I may have done to like offend you at some point? Like, what's going on? My middle name, ironically, is Hannah. I mean, I was like, this is getting ridiculous now. Like, I said to my parents, why would you give me, like, names have meaning. Why would you put that in my name? Like, this is insane. I've had a full on Abraham and Sarah moment. At one point, I spent a whole weekend telling my husband that he should have a child with someone else because that would fix that. Because that was the fixer mentality. That would fix the issue. My child would at least have like a half sibling. We can fix it. So I could kind of, as I was doing more study of the Bible, I was like seeing myself in all of these like characters. I was like, this is really weird. But yeah, without all of this stuff happening, it's made me confront a whole load of stuff. Yeah, wow. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. No.
Thanks for sharing that with us as well. Appreciate it. Appreciate it's something you're walking through at the minute as well. It can be feel quite vulnerable. Jessica, when we've spoken before, you mentioned about going through burnout, struggling with burnout. What has going through that burnout and that time taught you about your relationship with God?
Yeah, I think my relationship with God in those moments, I think, often wasn't at its best. I think they were the times when he was probably prompting me towards some guidance and I was choosing not to. I think that was part of it. And I think I've always had, as I've said, I've always had that sort of undercurrent of just knowing who God is. But I think it's the burnouts I found were the times when I would just choose to not lean on him, I think, actually, which is the worst decision, I think, to have had. But to be really honest, I think that's the decision I took each time I had it. I sort of had it at least once a year for the first 4 or 5 years in the job I'm in now. And I do actually think it was probably God. Physically, I was drained, so it was a physical reaction, but I also think God was trying to asked me to deal with things truthfully, and I chose not to because I didn't want to go too deep because it just felt too hard, too heavy. Even when I guess I knew who he was choosing not to sort of be close enough to him, that was my decision, I still knew he was God, and there was going to be some good. For me, I feel like it's taught me, looking back, to lean on him more, if I'm honest. Having not done it repeatedly, it still taught me that, I should have lent on him more in those times. And I think I am now dealing with that, however many years, 8 years later.
It's our privilege to have these meaningful conversations, and we hope you're enjoying them. As a registered charity, it's thanks to our generous donors and partners that we're able to bring the Magnify conversations to you, and we know there is so much more ahead. If you've been impacted by any of the chats we've had with these amazing women and want to continue seeing them, why not consider supporting us?
You can find out how to by visiting www.magnifycollective.com/donate and then financially giving in any way you feel led to. We're so grateful to you for being with us in this season, and we hope you find real value in this episode. Practically, how have you begun to manage those times where you've had burnout? My guess is that as you've gone along, you've learned maybe some trigger points or some things that you've thought, I can see that I'm kind of going to walk that path again. How have you managed to identify it and then either get the help that you need, or, as you said, maybe just needing to trust more in God at those times?
Yeah, I feel I can't say I did it. That would be lying. As much as I would want to say that,
No, we're being honest.
I think those 4 or 5 times I didn't do what I would try and advise my own self to do. I would pray desperately in those times, but I know I didn't sit with his word. I didn't sit and listen to what the Spirit was telling me. I just wasn't listening because I thought it would be too hard. Which seems so silly with also what I've told you about, the resilience of knowing he has the path. I think more recently, I really am, it has felt like a really tough start to the year. And so I really am just trying to spend more time with God's word in the morning and just pray on, even if it's one verse and one simple message, just pray on that and try and live that out in my day. And get back to praying and just chatting. My prayers are never sort of, too special. It's just chat, like I'm chatting with a friend, and that's when I feel most sort of connected to God, I guess. Yeah.
And what, in those kind of difficult times of burnout, what are some of the questions that you found yourself asking God? So, even in your conversation, you're saying it's just like speaking with a friend. What are some of the key questions that you've asked God in the middle of it?
Obviously, it's just why to begin with, but also I think it's been really questioning, again, purpose. As I say, I think that's the thing I've struggled with the most. And when I'm in a burnout, I start to question, is this still my purpose? Should I still be in this place? Am I, do I need to change something here? Or is that the easy way out? So I think it was always sort of questions around, what had made me burn out and whether God still had me there, because he very much put me in the job I'm in. So it was always questioning.
Yeah,
purpose.
assessing like, do I need to make a different move?
Yeah.
Is it my time? Is my time up?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Sheyi, how about you? Like in some of the last few years and the things you've been walking through as well, what kind of specific questions have you had for God? I'm sure there've been many, but you know, we've been thinking about questioning our faith is not always necessarily saying, God, are you there? Although sometimes it is, but it's sometimes questions around our belief about who he is and what he says he'll do when we feel like maybe he's not saying and doing the things that we expect him to.
Yeah. I think I've asked God a lot of, it's often hard sometimes believing in a God who is mighty and miraculous and can do all of these things. In a weird sort of way, I spent some time being quite jealous of my friends who were going through infertility who did not have a faith, because they just relied on science and facts, and they would just keep plugging away and go and talk about luck and be like, I might be lucky, I might not. But when you believe in a God, the God of the Bible who's like miraculous, delivers things, doesn't go along with the grain, can end things in an instant, well, then when you're praying, you go, well, but you could end this in a second. I mean, you could just stop all of this immediately, and that's the God that I believe in. So why are you not doing that? I think that would be my regular question. It'd be like, just end it, just cut it, and you're not doing it, and you are constantly asking why. I think that's probably been my most recent form of questioning or interrogation.
Yeah, interrogation. Because I think that you saying about faith, it can add almost a layer of complexity.
Yeah.
It's like you say, you're not just relying on science. It will, it won't. It's maybe pretty black and white, or it's luck, or whatever language we want to use. I think the difficulty sometimes is you're like, okay, I actually believe these things about God. So then, okay, where are you right now? It's a key thing.
It does. It also makes it. It's tricky. I think I can only speak from what we're going through now, but there are sort of like ethical questions that come up with things like IVF that Christians have to deal with that non-Christians don't. So, for example, if I didn't believe in God, didn't have a faith, I would just create as many embryos as possible. I wouldn't care about if there were any left over. Not care, but I wouldn't have as much of an attachment to them, I don't think. And I wouldn't be thinking that much about wastage. Whereas I know, and I've talked to other Christians about this, it's more difficult for us to just keep creating embryos, which is what doctors would like us to do, which is just keep banging them out, just get as many as possible. We just keep firing them back in until one of them works. It's much more difficult for us to do that. And then the praying and the faith becomes more complex, because you're like, God, I feel like this is tricky to just keep producing them because of my understanding of God, but then I really need you to intervene. So and that's why I'm saying the tension was difficult, because you look at people who didn't have a faith in the same way and they were like, it's fine, I'll just create 10 embryos, what's the problem? Like, if I don't use them, it's fine, it's not as much of a problem. Yes, a lot of people who don't have a faith have very much of an attachment to their embryos, no doubt about it, they do, but it wasn't as much of a tricky question. It was very difficult for the other Christians I met going through IVF to do that. And so then your conversations with God, just like, oh my goodness, can you please do something? Because I can't, there's a lot of tension going on here, as well as other stuff, and it just made it more complicated. So I agree with that. There's like an added layer of complication as well on top of some of this stuff, which is tricky.
And how are you presently managing that tension between your present reality, which is unknown, and we've talked a lot about that, but still having hope?
I challenged God a lot about track record. And actually, I then had to look back at God's track record in this particular season. And it was really clear to me that every time I thought I would either have a breakdown or completely lose it, or I concocted in my head this was going to be the end, I wouldn't make it past a certain period. Every single time it was like God just dropped a life raft in there. There was something that happened, or my husband and I connected in some way, or there was an extra bit of hope, or there was another option that we hadn't thought about, and God would just go, bang, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one, which is the phrase I was using earlier about preserving you in it. something and things that were inexplicable. I could not explain them. They kept happening. I was like, I should feel like this. Why do I feel like this? This doesn't make any sense. Like, what is going on? So I couldn't deny that. And it kept happening constantly, multiple times. So that's where the hope comes from. And I think also just opening your mind to, I got to a place where I was like, there might be other ways here of expanding our family. There might be other, and I need to be open to those. And as I started to become more open to them, again, I felt a bit more comfortable, but still not losing the hope of, something working out, blah, blah, just holding all of those things together. But the key thing for me was the life raft. Something kept happening every time I thought it would be, like, honestly, a disastrous end. It wasn't. And that's happened like 4 or 5 times. And I was like, and I think God was like, come on. Like this can't be a coincidence that every single time you think it's over, it's not over. And that was to do with IVF things, or to do with personal things. It just wasn't. It's never quite like that. So that's where I think that's what sustained us. Like we prayed about it, we pray about it regularly. We have like a small group at church, about it. We have our parent support. And also we're very, very blessed to have actually, I think 2 or 3 other Christian couples also going through secondary infertility or having been through it. And that's actually another life raft, because as soon as you see that, you're like, it's not just me. Like, there are other people here who have the same belief system as me, same thing, going through, not exactly the same, but they're going through like secondary infertility, primary infertility. There's actually quite a lot of us. And then you realize, okay, you're not alone. And some of those people have undoubtedly been like life rafts in our life, definitely. So I challenged God about track record. Yeah, God kind of answered about track record. Kind of answered about that, yeah.
And it keeps that hope.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
Like very, very,
challenging.
very, very clear as well. And I've always been one of the people I've always wanted to be one of those people in church where, someone has a word and it's specifically for me. Like, like on the money, like, it's me, I know it's me. And God has a joke with me about it. He's like, I don't need to give the word to someone else. I can talk to you very, very specifically yourself. And God can, because it's just, and that's what I mean by the life rafts and stuff. So God can do that. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jessica, how about you? And in those really difficult times that you've walked through, and I guess that you're figuring out, so you're still figuring some of that out. How do you manage that tension between your present reality, questions, frustrations, kind of, even when God's with you in the middle of it, the reality mixed with hope for the future, hope of kind of breaking through things or moving in your career or whatever it is, whatever personal thing it might be. How do you manage the tension of those 2 very real things?
Yeah, I think it is different on different days sometimes, but I am the eternal optimist. So I think I'm always quite a hopeful person, even when I feel like I am in the pit or the low or down in life. I am sort of the eternal optimist that it's going to work out. But I think choosing, am I going to be God-focused in this, or am I going to be self-focused in this, is always a choice. And I think that dictates the different days, probably. And it does feel easier and more natural, I think, to be self-focused, because it just is the natural way our minds work, isn't it? But I have seen being God-focused and just how that works and how he brings me through and where he takes me, and it probably isn't where I think I'm going, but the hindsight, again, it's always been a better place, or delivered in such a way that it's undeniable that it was the right way that it's happened. So yeah.
And you mentioned the terminology that you used was being in the pit. Yeah. And when you felt like you're in the pit, and for any of us, when we feel like we're in the pit, wherever that is, it's natural for us to use escapism and coping mechanisms. For worse or for better, we all do that from time to time. Have you been able to identify what some of those have been for you? So when you've been in the pit, what has been the escapism, and how have you manage to maybe do that in a healthy way?
I guess I've talked through it in a way in terms of like my burnouts, and my escapism was literally not dealing with it.
Right.
I think that has probably been my escapism. And it's a choice, even though it's an unconscious, or it seems unconscious at the time, it's still a choice. That's my escapism of a situation, is to avoid it, which is not ideal and exactly what I'm trying to deal with.
And do you feel that you've done that by like pouring yourself more into your work?
Yeah.
And like throwing yourself like head on into what you're doing?
Yeah. And I think I've often, because my father was very, he's a perfectionist, a very hard man, or he was, he's really softened. But growing up with that, I think my purpose in life was attached to work. So I think that's where it stems from for me, and what the driving factor has been. And I think it's been learning over the years and the seasons, like when God brought me back to London, it was for absolutely no logical reason. It was genuinely a desire of mine to live in London. I don't see what purpose that served him in bringing me back to London. But in him doing that, it just, the way he did it as well, it was barriers being knocked over. It just felt like he was giving me on a plate just something I wanted. I didn't need it. And so I think resting on that has got me through a lot of hard times, actually, in recent years. Yeah.
That's amazing. And Sheyi, how about you? Like, how have you kind of navigated that thing of coping mechanisms versus facing up to the real things? Because we all have a need for some level of escapism. We all have some kind of coping mechanisms at different times, like we're human. And whether that sounds like the right thing or not is the reality. Like, have you been able to identify what they are?
Yeah, my escapism is control. So I like to take control. And I think you mentioned something about your dad and being a perfectionist. I grew up in, my mum's Ghanaian, my dad's Nigerian, but in a West African Christian household, there's not much. What I observed as a child was there was not much self-responsibility. Everything that was good that happened was God. Everything that was bad that happened was the devil. And there was nothing in between, right? There was no self-responsibility. And I rebelled quite strongly against that. My parents weren't like that, but I could see that from a lot of aunties and uncles and stuff. And I rebelled against that. And I was like, no, you've got to get up, get on, do the stuff yourself. Okay, yes, pray about it and stuff, but you get on. So my default position and escapism is control. I like to have things ordered. I like to do things myself. And it's been a benefit in some areas of my life because I'm a self-starter. We run our own business. It's good in that practical sense, but it doesn't work with faith, right? I can't control like how everything works. And so my biggest challenge is surrender and learning that that escapism or how I want to deal with it, it can't work all the time. There are some times where you have to go, you know what, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I have to. And I'm the opposite to Jessica. I am not an optimist. I am a pessimist. So I will think that everything is going to go wrong, like it's disastrous. And if I don't sort it out or get in there and, get my hands dirty and do this, blah, 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 then it won't, work out. So, my escapism is control, and I have to work on letting go of control. And it's hard for me to do, very hard.
So, Jessica, you talked a little bit about how important your work is to you, but also how, I guess, maybe you found like your purpose, your identity has become really intertwined with that. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and just give us a bit more detail on like what that's been like for you? You said it's like been a big struggle for you.
It has. And I think that's why I've had those burnouts and have gone through those times of thinking, is this where I'm still supposed to be? I think, as I've just shared with, growing up in the way that I did, work was the purpose of life. That would make my father proud. So I think that's why I put so much energy into it. And I did love it. I think I started working at 13 and 9 months, because that was the youngest age you could start in Australia. And I loved work. I felt like I grew up in a lot of small towns. So for me, I was getting to do something, you know, outside of reading my books and just hanging around town. It was getting to do something. And I really grew to love it because I was always achieving something. And I think in a lot of my earlier jobs after my tertiary study, I was seen as an overachiever without realizing it because I was so excited to do everything the best way and improve what I could. And I think I actually annoyed a lot of people because I was constantly looking for improvements. And I think a lot of people were like, nothing, it's fine, you know. And so I think I enjoyed being recognized for that, I realized as well. And so I think my identity was very much tied into what I was doing. And so I felt successful if I was doing something right, but it felt like only work counted. It didn't count in terms of the relationships I had, or the amount of rest I had, or other personal hobbies or habits. Nothing else sort of seemed to count as a weight towards me as a person. It was work, I think. So I did, you know, in those burnouts, I think probably why I didn't want to address anything is because I didn't want anything to change, even though it probably needed to. Yes. So, and I think it's interesting because ultimately God brought me back over to London with my job. So I still feel a bit conflicted about why, maybe, but then, you know, I still am learning, obviously, as well. So yeah, my identity has been tied to there. I think the pandemic has been the biggest pivotal point for me, actually, in terms of just taking more rest and being able to sign off at the end of the day without my mind still thinking about everything else that's going on and what else we could improve and what else we can do, and anything attached to work. I think since the pandemic, I can switch off, and I love my weekends and my Sundays after church. So I guess I'm finally learning some rest, and I have a clearer head to be able to deal with things that when they come up, which I never had when I was just driving all my energy into achieving. And I really think I was missing God in that because I was just doing, and not listening.
Yeah. Shifting gear a little bit, you just mentioned church and Christianity. I think sometimes we're a little guilty of, when things are going well, saying that we're blessed. Now, I completely understand the sentiment of that. I get it. I suppose I'm interested to hear both of your thoughts on that, because I guess my question is, like, when things are not going so well, when we are feeling like we're in the pit, or we're going through some very challenging times personally, or even in our faith, does that mean we're no longer blessed based on the definition that we seem to always attach it to? So you don't often hear people who are going through a difficult time saying, I'm blessed. I mean, maybe you know people that do that. I don't. I guess, how has that word and how has that sentiment been challenged in your darker moments?
Yeah, I think it's very actually problematic with things like fertility and actually things like singleness in the church and fertility. Very, very problematic, because you can end up looking like you're saying, or churches can end up looking like they're saying that people who are struggling with fertility are not blessed, which is very problematic, because there's lots of people in the Bible who had that issue, and they were. So it is sort of like a dangerous thing to go with. In terms of my understanding, I've actually been, there's a verse, I can't remember it, which basically says, almost in a way, the more that you're challenged, the more blessed you are. Because it's like God refining your faith, like metal being refined. And I don't think, my other understanding is, I feel like there are sort of like 3 key different reasons why you'll get problems in life. 1 is because you did something stupid. 2 is because it's just life. Life happens. The world is fragmented and broken, so things just happen. And 3 would be sort of attacks, as in something, evil has happened. Those are the mainly 3 different reasons. And in those 3 scenarios, you could be blessed in all of them, to be honest. All 3 of them, you can be blessed in them. But all 3 of them will happen at some point to everyone. So I don't think just because things are going well, you're necessarily blessed. It just means things happen to be going well at that point, which is great. But just because things are not going well does not mean that you're not blessed. And the key thing to understand is that God is with you throughout all of it. And everyone, everywhere, every human being, even though it may look like, social media doesn't help with this, that somebody else's life is glossy and they're not having any issues. Oh, it's coming. Like everyone's going to have their stuff to deal with from any of those three viewpoints. So I think, there are some situations where it is problematic for people, in church especially, to start attaching blessing to only good things that are happening, because there are lots of things that are happening that are not people's fault. Children get cancer. That does not mean that they're not blessed. I mean, it's one of those horrific life things that happen, and it has nothing to do with that family making a mistake. Like, I was recently reading in Job, where Job's friends go to him and basically say, have you done something wrong, mate? Like, what's wrong? What have you done to have this calamity on your head? And Job's like, I actually haven't done anything wrong. And that was totally the truth. So I think it's important for people to get across that nuance, especially as people of faith and in the church, is really important, because it's not true, and it can be problematic. It can really upset people as well.
Yeah, I agree. How do you see that rhetoric? How have you understood that, Jessie?
I see blessing. I really thought about this. I see blessing as the love of God, actually. I think my earliest memory of feeling blessed was I was 16 and had come out of a 3-year really bad depression, suicidal depression. And I remember coming through it and looking back at it. It all sort of ended quickly, and I looked back at it quickly, within 2 weeks. And I felt grateful. And I was amazed I felt grateful, because I felt that God had brought me through it for a reason, and my character had been shaped. And it was that verse, in James, of, count it a blessing or a joy, count it all a joy when he gives you the trials, and because it's sharpening your faith, essentially. And I felt that as a young person. I still am amazed that I felt that way at that time. And I think since then, it's just when I feel blessed, when things are going well, it feels the love of God. But I think even in those challenging times, it's resting on the love of God and knowing that he is God, that still does feel like I am blessed in this, even if it doesn't feel like I'm in a comfortable position. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's when we attach it to things and only good things. I think you said, Sheyi, it becomes problematic. And it becomes kind of this is interesting in how we see God and how we see faith and life as well. And Jessica, I'm interested because you were speaking about, obviously your career's been a big thing and your life, and you were saying you actually felt you've been disobedient, I guess, sometimes, or taken a bit of a wrong turn, maybe, in your words. How did you come to a point of recognizing that? Was that through friends or was that just through you coming to your sense of, this is me?
No, it was myself. Yeah. And I think that the disobedience, I feel like it was linked to the burnouts that we've talked a lot about, I guess. I think it was choosing to not look to God fully. I had a strong faith, but just was not living by that faith, I would say. So for me, that is disobedience. And I think I've realised it because of the length of time of not dealing with it, I guess.
Yeah, and it just become real to you.
It becomes something that I realise God is trying to teach me something here. Why put it off? It's of no benefit to me. Yeah.
Sheyi, I want to circle back a little bit to something you said earlier. Yes. Just with your experience with secondary infertility, you also said that your parents went through the exact same thing. How do you just emotionally protect yourself against that fear of, is this just history repeating itself? I think that's actually the words you used. This really feels like history repeating itself. Yeah. How do you stop that from being the thing that's ticking over in your mind all the time? Because it makes perfect sense that it would be something that is very hard to reject as a thought.
Yeah, it's been really, really difficult. I've had to pray about it a lot, talk to God about it a lot. My husband is super supportive, and he's been really good at reminding me that, we're not them, because we're different people and we're different. And in the same way, I haven't really talked to my current daughter. I'm really blessed. She just doesn't have a flipping clue what's going on. It's not the same. And there are certain things I wouldn't rerun, so I don't blame my parents for it at all. And everybody, deals with things differently, but I wouldn't get Isabella to pray about having a sibling every week. I wouldn't do that. And And there are things that I would do differently because I'm just a different person. And I think that, did really affect me. So yeah, it's very, very hard to come against the narrative that we're just running the same cycle. But I just try to remember that, I am a different person. We're in a different situation. God does things differently for different people.
Yeah,
so yeah.
Absolutely right. And just through your experience, obviously there'll be a lot of women in our Magnify community who have been through something that you've been through, whether it be grief or infertility, just some of the story that you've told. What would be kind of your biggest piece of wisdom from your lived experience?
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of wisdom would be this. When you are in it, there's a lot of pain and you cannot see what it is like to come out of the other side. You're basically blinded. You've got no vision. And it's at that point that you have to dive in deeper with God. Go against your instinct, which is to run away. Do the opposite of your instinct, which is go in and really explore that relationship. And I can guarantee with things like fertility, it cannot last forever. At some point, you will turn 50, 60, and this will be, it's out, like it's done. So it's one of those things, one of those raw pains, it just can't last forever. There are multiple ways to grow a family. You got to be open to those, and you will come out the other side. It's very difficult to hear at the time, but there is an end point with this particular issue. So you will come out. Wow. You will come out. You have to, because there is like an end point, which is really important. You have to kind of like cling on to it. You won't be in that state of pain the whole time. Yeah, it lasts forever. Yeah.
Jessica, how about you? What would be like your biggest piece of wisdom through the things that you've been through for maybe like one of the women listening to this that you could offer them that they're like, okay, that's really helpful?
I think the biggest thing I've learned is to praise God even when things aren't going well, praise and prayer. And exactly as Sheyi has said, is dig deeper. I haven't always done it, but in hindsight, I would have loved to have said I've done it every time. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, amazing. So how have you learned to invite God into all aspects of your life? So not just the difficult times, not just the pit, but the highs as well. And why do you think it's important that we do that?
Not there's no point, but obviously it's easier for human beings in general when we're in desperate times to start screaming and going, help me, help me, help me. But, God wants to be involved in the good stuff as well. When, there's good stuff happening and in just like the little bits, because he wants a relationship. He doesn't just want, you press the emergency button and then you want to talk to me. And like, no, talk to me all the time. Have a relationship with me.
And in any healthy relationship, we try to be there through every season and every up and down, don't we? Yeah. Which makes, perfect sense. Love that. Jessica, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think if it's prayer for me, which is just sort of conversation, I guess, with God more than anything else, and just that connection, keeping that connection. And for me, it's a reminder. It's more a reminder for me, I think, to just be engaged with God just through those prayers and conversations having with him every day.
Just day to day.
Like a friend, as you say. Exactly. Yeah.
As we are a community of women, we would love to know like any way we can support like any of your upcoming endeavours. Is there anything that's going on for you at the minute, Sheyi, that like you would just like to tell our community about?
Yeah, I'm going to be releasing a lot more music and things like that. I think, I'm going to basically be putting a lot more music on my Instagram, which will be good. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm sure it will be amazing. Jessica, how about you? How can our community further support like anything that's coming up for you at the minute?
I'm just chipping away at growing our bridal brand. That I work for Halfpenny London, so I guess we'd just love to see any of the Magnify brides come through.
Oh, yes. I love that.
Yeah.
Ladies, this has been a really helpful conversation. We know that faith is a non-linear journey. It's full of confusing times of deep joy and highs, lows, everything in between. But I think just being real and authentic in the middle of this is helpful. Understanding what blessing means has been a huge takeaway for me and what that represents. So this has been a great conversation. I'm so grateful to you both for sharing your stories. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's been an honour to see Magnify grow to where we are today. If you've loved this conversation and want more from Magnify, why not check out our print magazine?
Across the 10 editions, we've had the privilege of featuring a multiple of changemakers and pioneers such as Suzanne Hendricks, Jerry Lorenzo, Joe Malone, and many more.
The magazine is a beautiful physical product that makes the perfect coffee table companion to complement your space.
And even more than the look, it creates the perfect excuse to take some time to read a collection of timeless features that will enrich your life whatever stage you're at. Head to magnifycollective.com/shop to purchase your copy now.
The Magnify Conversations mean so much to us as a team. It really impacts us every day and encourages us so much when we see your comments, your DMs, and to know that these conversations are truly making an impact in the best times of your life, but also challenging, is such an honour. We hope you've enjoyed today and we can't wait to see you next Monday.